Take off that ring right this second, because if Julian gave it to you, he just handed you something that never belonged to him in the first place." The low, measured voice of Leonard Sterling fell across the grand dining room of the Newport estate like a crack of winter thunder. Nora, who only moments earlier had been laughing softly and angling her right hand so the heavy vintage sapphire caught the golden glow of the crystal chandelier, froze in place. The patriarch of the family had not shouted, nor had he slammed his fists against the polished mahogany table, but the steady extension of his weathered hand was enough to silence the room completely. Across the table, Elena sat with her spine perfectly straight, her face pale in the candlelight, her lips pressed into a tight, quiet line that hid a lifetime of unspoken hurt. None of the cousins or extended relatives gathered for the weekend dinner understood why Leonard had darkened so suddenly at the sight of the gemstone, nor why he was staring at his own grandson with a mixture of profound grief and simmering outrage. Nora attempted a light, dismissive chuckle to ease the suffocating stillness, but the sound withered in her throat as Leonard took one deliberate step closer and repeated, his eyes never leaving the blue jewel, "I said, give me your hand." For several seconds, nobody in the dining hall seemed to breathe. The grandfather clock ticking heavily against the dark walnut paneling, and the portraits of 4 generations of Sterlings staring down from the walls. Nora cast an urgent, pleading look toward Julian, who rose abruptly from his chair with the defensive arrogance of a man accustomed to commanding corporate boardrooms and controlling every narrative around him. "Grandfather, please, I was the one who gave it to her," Julian said, his voice carrying an edge of practiced authority that failed to mask the tension tightening his shoulders. Leonard turned his head slowly, fixing his gaze upon his grandson with an expression so cold it made the younger man flinch. "I am well aware that you gave it to her, Julian," the old man replied quietly. "What I have yet to understand is the exact moment you began to believe you had the right to dispose of something that was never yours to give." A muted murmur rippled through the gathering, while Elena lowered her eyes to her own empty, ringless hands in silence. She knew the sacred history behind that sapphire better than anyone in the room, but she chose not to speak, knowing that this confrontation had not truly begun with a piece of jewelry, but with long, grueling months of quiet cruelty and emotional neglect. 3 months earlier, Elena had spent nearly every evening dining alone in their brownstone overlooking Boston Common, listening to the city traffic hum beneath the window while the dinner on the stove grew cold. Julian had gradually stopped coming home at a reasonable hour, offering brief, clipped explanations about late client meetings, unexpected flights down to Manhattan, or dinners with venture partners that stretched well past midnight. Elena had eventually ceased asking questions altogether, because every inquiry was immediately twisted into an unfair indictment of her character. "Stop turning my schedule into a grand jury trial," Julian had snapped one evening, tossing his car keys onto the entryway marble with visible disgust. "I have an entire life, a career, and responsibilities that exist outside the confines of this marriage, and I will not apologize for being ambitious." The words had cut far deeper than she cared to let on, not because she was naive to the fractures widening between them, but because he was no longer making any effort to conceal his indifference. Julian could still be charming and attentive in front of donors, family members, and business associates, but behind closed doors he had adopted a calculated coldness toward his wife, and Elena had chosen to watch and wait, not out of weakness, but because she needed to see the full measure of who her husband had truly become. The undeniable truth had presented itself on a mild Sunday afternoon during an informal family brunch at the Newport estate, when Elena arrived to find Nora seated comfortably on the garden terrace beside Julian. Nobody had formally introduced the younger woman as Julian's partner, but the possessive manner in which Nora rested her manicured hand upon his forearm left no room for misunderstanding among the gathered guests. Julian had casually introduced her as a close creative associate and dear friend, a transparent lie that Elena accepted with nothing more than a polite nod before quietly taking her usual seat beside Leonard. That serene composure had infuriated Nora far more than any dramatic shouting match ever could, for she had anticipated tears, jealous accusations, and an embarrassing public scene that would prove she had successfully unseated the wife. Instead, Elena gave her no such satisfaction, sitting through the meal with grace while Nora deliberately dropped intimate references to weekend getaways, private jokes, and shared memories from their recent trips to Aspen and Miami. Several relatives looked down at their plates in awkward discomfort, while Leonard remained stone-faced, and Elena calmly finished her herbal tea without shedding a single tear in front of them. From that Sunday onward, Nora refused to remain a hidden presence in Julian's life, demanding to attend private gatherings, step inside the family's historical residences, and gradually claim the spaces that rightfully belonged to his wife. Julian, increasingly resentful of Elena's calm emotional detachment, began indulging Nora's boldest requests, viewing his wife's refusal to plead for his affection as an unforgivable slight against his masculine vanity. Nora expertly stoked those flames of resentment, whispering in his ear during late-night drives that Elena only cared about maintaining the sterling social standing and retaining the family name. Julian absorbed every poison drop of that narrative, convincing himself that Elena's dignity was merely cold apathy, and the more indifferent he perceived her to be, the more desperate he became to prove that she was entirely replaceable. Nora recognized that profound insecurity early on, realizing she did not need to destroy the marriage through open warfare when she could simply manipulate Julian into dismantling his own vows piece by piece. One afternoon, while touring the estate gallery with Julian, Nora stopped before an oil painting of an elegant woman wearing a dark velvet gown and a magnificent sapphire ring encircled by brilliant diamonds. When Julian confirmed it was a portrait of his late grandmother, Evelyn Sterling, Nora tilted her head with feigned innocence and asked why she had never seen Elena wear such an exquisite family heirloom, a question that struck directly at Julian's fragile ego and planted a dangerous, spiteful seed in his mind. Elena understood the profound weight of that sapphire far better than her husband ever cared to realize, remembering vividly the private morning just after their wedding when Leonard had opened a worn velvet box in the estate library. The old man had explained that Evelyn had worn that very ring for over 40 years, not as a badge of wealth or social dominance, but as an emblem of enduring loyalty, sacrifice, and moral duty to the family. Deeply moved by the gesture, Elena had gently declined to wear it on a daily basis, explaining to Leonard that she never wanted anyone to think she required an expensive jewel to validate her devotion or prove her belonging in the family circle. Leonard had not been offended by her refusal. On the contrary, her humility had earned his deepest respect, and, from that day forward, the ring remained secured in his antique writing desk under a quiet, shared understanding. Julian had known fragments of that conversation, but to his shallow worldview, his grandfather's customs were merely dusty relics of an obsolete era, whereas to Elena, the heirloom was intimately tied to the genuine kindness Leonard had extended when she was still an outsider, adjusting to an intimidating dynasty. In the weeks that followed, Julian's behavior deteriorated into blatant disrespect, openly bringing Nora to high-profile charity galas in the city and boasting about her presence, even in conversations held within Elena's hearing. One night, after a bitter disagreement in their Boston kitchen, Julian sneered that carrying the Sterling name did not grant her a permanent lease on his life. to which Elena replied with heartbreaking serenity that she remained only out of respect for the promises she had made before God, prompting him to laugh bitterly and accuse her of acting morally superior to everyone else. A few days later, while Leonard was away visiting an old friend in Vermont, Julian drove down to the Newport mansion alone, walked into the quiet library, and pulled open the lower drawer of the mahogany desk to retrieve the blue velvet box. He hesitated for only a fleeting fraction of a second, reminding himself that he was a direct heir by blood, and therefore entitled to claim any heirloom he saw fit to bestow. When he presented the open box to Nora in the sunlit parlor later that afternoon, her eyes widened with triumphant delight, and she asked with breathy excitement if it was truly the sapphire from the portrait. "Put it on," Julian had urged her with reckless satisfaction, eager to imagine the devastating look on Elena's face when she finally saw another woman wearing the ultimate family treasure. 2 days afterward, Elena stopped by the Newport house to deliver legal correspondence for Leonard, glanced into the library, and immediately noticed the antique desk drawer resting slightly ajar. Upon opening the familiar box and finding the velvet cushion completely bare, she stood in absolute silence, feeling a heavy weight settle in the pit of her stomach as she recognized that her husband had officially crossed a line from private betrayal to calculated public cruelty. Leonard returned that evening, immediately noticed the theft, and learned from the household staff that Julian had visited the study. But rather than calling his grandson in a blind rage, the patriarch chose to wait for the upcoming Saturday dinner, knowing that true accountability required the truth to be exposed in the light of day. When the family gathered for dinner that fateful Saturday night, Elena arrived wearing a simple, elegant black dress with her hair swept up, stepping into the dining hall alone with an aura of quiet dignity. Julian was already seated near the center of the table, and beside him sat Nora in an ivory silk dress, resting her hand purposefully on the white linen tablecloth so the blue sapphire caught every reflection of light in the room. When Nora smugly greeted her by remarking how surprised she was that Elena had managed to attend, Elena merely held her gaze and replied that an invitation to family dinner was not something one easily declined. Throughout the meal, Nora repeatedly flaunted the ring, lifting her wine glass, reaching for bread baskets, and tenderly touching Julian's shoulder, while loudly asking Elena if she recognized the breathtaking piece of jewelry. Elena remained unfazed, answering calmly that she recognized it well, while refusing to give Nora the satisfaction of a screaming match or a tearful breakdown. When Nora pushed further, condescendingly suggesting that marriage certificates could not force a man to keep choosing the same person forever, Elena set her silver fork down and replied with quiet power that while no one could be forced to love, there was a vast difference between being chosen and being used as a weapon to hurt an innocent person. Before Julian could defend his companion's brazen behavior, the double doors swung open, and Leonard entered the room, his sharp eyes surveying the table until they landed directly upon the brilliant blue sapphire resting on Nora's finger. "Where did you get that ring?" Leonard asked, his tone deceptively mild as he stepped into the dining room, though the sudden chill in his voice caused every casual conversation along the table to instantly die away. Nora looked down at her right hand, her face lighting up with the practiced, triumphant smile she had rehearsed for weeks, completely convinced that the moment of her official ascension into high society had finally arrived. "Julian gave it to me, Mr. Sterling," she announced proudly, tilting her chin up so the entire room could hear her claim. Leonard did not offer a congratulatory word, nor did he return her smile. Instead, he pushed his chair back and rose to his full, commanding height, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. Julian stood up quickly, raising a hand in a desperate bid to manage the situation before it unraveled in front of their relatives. "Grandfather, please, this is a personal matter between us. Let us discuss this privately in the study after dinner," Julian pleaded, his composure beginning to crack under the weight of the old man's unyielding stare. Leonard did not even spare his grandson a glance. He simply walked around the long mahogany table, stopped directly beside Nora's chair, and extended his open palm toward her, demanding with calm authority, "Give me your hand." Nora let out a nervous, fluttering laugh, shifting uncomfortably in her seat as she looked to Julian for protection. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Sterling?" "My hand?" she stammered, the color beginning to drain from her cheeks. Leonard kept his arm outstretched, his expression carved from weathered granite. "Yes, your hand. Now." Julian took an aggressive step forward, placing himself partially between his grandfather and his companion. "Grandfather, that is enough. There is absolutely no need to make a theatrical scene in front of our guests," Julian insisted, trying to assert his position as the heir to the estate. Leonard slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze cutting straight through the younger man's facade. "The only person who staged a disgraceful scene in this house was you, Julian, the very moment you brought this woman to my table, wearing an heirloom you had no moral right to touch." A collective gasp echoed softly through the dining room as aunts, uncles, and cousins lowered their eyes, the absolute gravity of the patriarch's fury becoming undeniable. Julian clenched his fists at his sides, his pride wounded. "I carry the Sterling name, grandfather, and as your eldest grandson, I have a right to this family's legacy." Leonard looked back at him with profound sorrow. "Carrying our name is precisely why you should have understood the sacred duty of honor, rather than treating this heritage like your personal playground." Turning his attention entirely back to Nora, Leonard commanded for the third time, "Give me your hand." Stripped of her artificial confidence, Nora slowly lifted her trembling fingers, and Leonard grasped her hand with an iron, unyielding grip that brooked no resistance. With slow, deliberate precision, the old man slipped the heavy platinum band off her ring finger, while Nora sat with her mouth slightly open, burning with an overwhelming sense of public humiliation. Julian moved to intervene once more, his voice cracking with desperation. "Grandfather, I made the conscious choice to give her that ring." Leonard pulled the sapphire completely free, holding the gleaming jewel between his thumb and forefinger so that its deep blue facets caught the chandelier light for every witness to behold. "And that, Julian, is the exact root of your failure," Leonard declared, his voice ringing through the vaulted ceiling. "You presumed to give away something that never belonged to your pride, your vanity, or your fleeting impulses." Nora stared at her bare, reddened finger, the devastating sting of shame washing over her as she realized she had been stripped of her trophy in front of the very society she sought to conquer. Elena watched the unfolding drama from the far end of the table, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Yet she felt no surge of petty triumph or vindictive joy. What she was witnessing was not a personal victory, but the tragic, public fracture of a family and the total moral collapse of the man she had loved for nearly a decade. Leonard closed his weathered fingers tightly around the sapphire, turned his back on Nora, and addressed Julian with devastating clarity. "You have the freedom to destroy your own marriage if your character is truly that weak," the patriarch said, each word landing like a hammer blow. "You may abandon your sacred vows, your personal integrity, and the fundamental respect you owe the woman who stood by you through every hardship. But you will not drag the honorable name of this family into the gutter, nor will you use our sacred history to turn your cruelty into a public performance." The silence in the dining room was absolute. Not a single person dared to clear their throat or shift in their chair, while Julian stood frozen, his mouth opening slightly as if searching for a defense, but finding no words capable of shielding him from the truth. Nora looked up at Julian with wide, frantic eyes, desperately waiting for him to unleash his usual arrogance, challenge the old man, and storm out of the house with her on his arm. But Julian remained rooted to the floorboards, paralyzed by the realization that his grandfather had stripped away his illusion of untouchable authority in a matter of seconds. Leonard then turned slowly and walked the length of the dining table toward Elena, his heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood. When he reached her chair, he stopped, gently opened his palm, and placed the cold, brilliant sapphire into her open hand. Elena stared down at the jewel, the deep blue stone glistening against her pale skin, before looking up into Leonard's kind, sorrowful eyes. "Leonard, please, I cannot accept this," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Leonard placed a warm, reassuring hand over hers and shook his head gently. "I am not asking you to wear it, my dear," he replied softly, ensuring everyone at the table could hear his words. "I am simply returning what should have never been taken from this house in such a disgraceful manner." Julian stepped toward them, the sudden realization of what he had permanently lost finally dawning behind his eyes. But Elena simply closed her fingers around the cool platinum, rose from her seat, and smoothed down her black dress with deliberate grace. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears, yet her posture remained unbroken, radiating a quiet, unshakable strength that commanded the respect of every relative in attendance. "Thank you, Leonard," she said softly, offering a brief, respectful nod to the patriarch. Nobody cheered, nobody applauded, and no one dared to smile. The room felt heavy with the solemnity of a funeral, witnessing the irreversible unraveling of a marriage before their very eyes. Without looking back at her husband or sparing a single glance at the humiliated woman across the table, Elena turned and walked gracefully out of the dining hall, the heavy oak doors closing softly behind her as she stepped into the dimly lit corridor. Julian remained standing by the ruined table, trapped between the burning resentment of his mistress and the absolute disappointment of the grandfather who had once believed in him. Out in the quiet hallway, Elena stopped near the grand staircase, leaned against the dark wainscoting, and opened her trembling hand to look down at the sapphire. For years, she had deliberately avoided wearing that ring, wanting her marriage to be defined by genuine companionship rather than an ostentatious display of status and generational wealth. Yet, tonight, that very same heirloom had been wielded like a weapon, designed specifically to degrade her and announce to the world that her husband viewed her as an obsolete possession to be cast aside. She closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath of the cool evening air, and felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. What hurt the most was not Nora's petty malice, nor was it the physical loss of the jewelry. It was the chilling memory of Julian sitting in cowardly silence while another woman humiliated his wife using a stolen piece of his family's soul. Walking down the grand front steps into the crisp Rhode Island night, a profound certainty crystallized within Elena's spirit. Leonard had reclaimed the sapphire, but no one on earth could ever restore the respect that Julian had so callously destroyed. Elena did not wait for the dinner to conclude. She summoned a car service to the estate gates and slipped into the passenger seat just as Julian burst through the heavy front doors, frantically rushing down the stone stairs. "Elena, wait! We have to talk about this," he called out, his voice breathless as he reached the open window of the vehicle. Elena turned her head slowly, looking at him through the glass with an expression of profound, weary detachment. We had an entire evening to talk, Julian, she said, her voice entirely devoid of anger. You chose to sit in absolute silence while Nora insulted me at your grandfather's table. Julian furrowed his brow, frustrated by her unnatural calm. Don't exaggerate this. Nora overstepped her bounds, but my grandfather created an absurd spectacle over nothing. Elena placed her hand on the door handle to close it completely. That is your fundamental flaw, Julian. You still believe this entire night was about a piece of jewelry? For me, it was the night I finally saw just how far you were willing to go to break my spirit. The car pulled away into the darkness, leaving Julian standing alone on the gravel driveway, watching the red taillights vanish into the night. When Julian finally trudged back into the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with awkwardness as the remaining guests made quiet, hasty excuses to leave, murmuring polite apologies to Leonard before retreating toward the foyer. Nora was standing near the fireplace, trembling with rage, her bare hand clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Leonard remained seated at the head of the table, calmly sipping black coffee, while the staff quietly cleared the untouched plates. "Are you going to let him treat me like a common criminal?" Nora demanded, her voice shrill with indignation as she rounded on Julian the moment the last cousin exited the room. "He ripped that ring off my hand in front of everyone like I was a thief." Leonard set his porcelain cup down with a soft click and raised his steady gaze. "You were treated as someone wearing something that did not belong to you, young lady," the old man stated, without raising his voice. Julian held up a placating hand, desperate to end the confrontation. "Grandfather, please. That is enough for tonight." Leonard planted both hands firmly on the table and leaned forward. "It is not enough, Julian. You have confused financial wealth with moral entitlement. You brought your mistress into my home, permitted her to insult your lawful wife, and stole an heirloom entrusted to my care. You will not stand in this room and make me the villain of your moral failure." Nora had expected Julian to defend her with the same fiery arrogance he displayed when he had boldly slipped the sapphire onto her finger days earlier, but his sudden hesitation and downward gaze filled her with a cold, creeping dread. Up until that evening, she had genuinely believed that keeping Julian locked in an emotional battle with Elena would steadily guarantee her own transition into the official Mrs. Sterling. Yet the family's icy reaction proved beyond any doubt that occupying a man's bed did not automatically grant access to his lineage or the respect of his community. When they finally climbed into Julian's luxury sedan to begin the long, silent drive back to Boston, Nora could no longer contain her mounting fury. "You told me your marriage was dead and buried," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the engine. Julian gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the highway ahead. "It is over." "It is over, Nora," she scoffed loudly. "Then why did every single person in that room treat Elena like she was royalty, while treating me like dirt on their shoes? Nobody defended me, Julian. Nobody even looked at me like I mattered." Julian exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. "What did you expect me to do against my grandfather?" Nora leaned closer, her eyes blazing. "I expect you to stop keeping a wife if you claim to have chosen another woman. Demand a divorce tomorrow, or prove to me that I am not just a temporary diversion." Elena arrived back at the Boston brownstone shortly before midnight, leaving the foyer in soft shadows as she carried her handbag up to the second floor. She entered the master bedroom, unlocked the small cedar chest where she kept her personal papers, and carefully placed the blue velvet box containing the sapphire inside, just as Leonard had instructed her to do for safekeeping. Standing before the antique vanity mirror, She unclasped her pearl earrings and looked closely at her reflection, seeing a woman who was utterly exhausted from spending years attempting to maintain a partnership entirely on her own. She did not feel a sense of triumph over Nora, nor did she feel vindicated by Leonard's intervention. She simply felt the heavy, quiet sorrow of a final ending. That night, lying awake in the guest bedroom down the hall, Elena made a firm and unshakable promise to herself. She would never engage in another petty dispute with Nora. The true problem had never been the other woman. The problem was the man who had deliberately left the door open and invited the chaos inside. If Julian truly wished to sever their union, he would have to look her directly in the eyes and do so without hiding behind the drama of a third party. The following morning, Julian returned to the brownstone to find Elena sitting peacefully by the sunlit breakfast nook, reading the morning paper over a cup of black coffee. Without offering a morning greeting, he leaned against the kitchen counter, his face lined with tension. "Where is the ring?" he asked abruptly. Elena placed her cup onto its saucer without looking up. "It is safely put away." Julian let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Give it back to my grandfather, Elena. Since when do you make executive decisions about my family's property?" Elena met his gaze with steady composure. "I will return it the moment your grandfather asks for it. Yesterday, you seemed to have no issue deciding the fate of family property when you chose to hand your grandmother's ring to your mistress." Julian's jaw tightened as he crossed his arms. "I never intended to humiliate you publicly." Elena stood up slowly, smoothing her linen trousers. "Then explain your intentions, Julian. What purpose did it serve to take your grandmother's most cherished heirloom, place it on the hand of another woman, and parade her across from me at dinner? You wanted a reaction. You wanted to see me broken, desperate, and begging for your attention. What you never anticipated is discovering that I am simply too tired to fight for a man who derives pleasure from testing my limits." Julian felt a sharp sting of wounded pride at her calm words, stepping closer as he tried to reassert his dominance. "You always do this, Elena. You speak from this high moral pedestal as if you are completely above human emotion." Elena picked up her purse from the dining table. "I am not above anything, Julian. I have simply reached the point where I refuse to degrade myself just to prove that your cruelty hurts." Julian followed her toward the hallway, his frustration mounting. "So, what do you want from me now? An apology?" Elena paused at the front door and looked at him with profound clarity. "I want respect, though I am no longer certain you are capable of giving it. And I am currently deciding whether I still wish to remain your wife." For the first time since their troubles began, Julian's expression shifted from arrogance to genuine alarm. He had always operated under the comfortable assumption that Elena's patience was bottomless, and that she would forever endure his absences and provocations. "Don't make ridiculous threats, Elena," he said, his voice dropping. "You are using last night's incident to punish me." Elena shook her head gently. "I do not need to punish you, Julian. Your own choices are already handling that task quite well." Later that afternoon, Nora sat in her luxury high-rise apartment, staring at her phone in growing disbelief after receiving a brief text message from Julian, canceling their planned dinner without any substantial explanation. When she called him twice and was sent straight to voicemail, her anxiety quickly morphed into bitter resentment, realizing that instead of driving Julian further away from his wife, the humiliation at the estate had sent him spiraling into uncertainty. She immediately telephoned a close confidant, pouring out her frustrations over a glass of white wine. "I refuse to remain the secret woman he only visits, when he is angry with his wife," Nora vented, pacing across her hardwood floor. "I want his public life, his name, and his status. If he is too cowardly to file for divorce on his own, I will make staying with Elena so unbearable that he will have no other choice." Knowing that Julian despised feeling overtly controlled, Nora adopted a subtler tactic. That evening, she sent him a single, calculated message. "I will not beg you to choose me again, Julian. I will simply watch what you do next." She then switched off her phone, leaving him to stew in his own guilt and indecision. Meanwhile, Leonard summoned Elena back to the Newport estate for a private afternoon meeting in the sun-drenched library, where the empty desk drawer remained slightly open, as a quiet testament to what had occurred. "You do not have to protect Julian when you are speaking with me, Elena," the old man said gently, motioning for her to sit in the leather armchair across from him. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking out toward the Atlantic coastline. "I am not trying to protect him, Leonard. I am simply trying to maintain my own peace." Leonard shook his head, leaning heavily on his carved wooden cane. "You have been protecting his reputation for months, my dear. Every time someone in the family asked why he arrived alone in Boston or skipped holiday gatherings, you manufactured polite excuses. Discretion is a noble virtue, Elena, but it becomes a dangerous trap when it begins to shield another person's absolute lack of respect." Elena sighed deeply, looking at the floor. "I never wanted our private struggles to become a public spectacle." Leonard leaned forward, his voice filled with grandfatherly warmth. "Your husband made it a spectacle on his own. Do not let anyone convince you that enduring cruelty in silence is a demonstration of true love." Elena looked at the patriarch, surprised by the candor of a man who had spent his entire life fiercely guarding the unity and reputation of his lineage. "I thought you would ask me to fight for the marriage, Leonard," she admitted softly. Leonard smiled faintly, with a deep sadness in his eyes. "I would ask you to fight for it if I saw two people actively trying to preserve their sacred vows. But I only see one person bearing the entire burden. Julian has been given everything too easily in his life: wealth, prestige, second chances, and unconditional forgiveness. Whenever he made a reckless mistake as a young man, someone was always there to clean up the mess before he ever tasted the bitter consequences of his actions. I thought maturity would teach him wisdom, but perhaps I was mistaken." Leonard rose and walked over to the tall arched window overlooking the gardens. I am not confronting Julian to avenge your honor, Elena. I am confronting him because he is my grandson, and someone must finally teach him that being born a sterling does not give him the right to step on the souls of others." Elena thanked him with genuine gratitude, but as she left the estate grounds, she knew in her heart that the fragile thread holding her marriage together had finally snapped beyond repair. That very evening, Julian's phone buzzed with an incoming call from his grandfather, demanding his immediate presence at the Newport estate the following morning. If this is going to be another exhausting lecture about the sapphire grandfather, I have nothing more to add, Julian answered defensively, leaning back on the leather sofa in his Boston living room. I have no desire to discuss the jewelry, Julian, Leonard replied with unyielding firmness over the line. I intend to speak about the woman you took an oath to cherish and protect. Julian let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. My marriage is entirely my own private business. Leonard's tone dropped an octave, resonating with sheer authority. It ceased to be private the second you paraded another woman into my dining room to humiliate your wife. Now it is a matter of basic family decency and honor. Be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The line went dead, leaving Julian feeling cornered and increasingly agitated. Rather than using the quiet evening to reflect on his actions, his wounded ego drove him straight to Nora's apartment, seeking the easy validation and flattery he had grown accustomed to receiving from her. Nora opened the door, wearing an expression of calculated coolness, offering no warm embrace and asking no questions about his family or the dinner disaster. She poured 2 glasses of scotch and sat opposite him, waiting with deliberate patience for Julian to break the heavy silence. "My grandfather is turning this entire situation into a full-scale war," Julian complained, taking a heavy sip from his glass. Nora looked at him with an icy smile. "Your grandfather did not declare war on you, Julian. He simply made it abundantly clear to everyone in that room that I am entirely insignificant to your family." Julian reached for her hand, but she smoothly pulled it away. "Elena can afford to sit back in saintly silence because she knows the entire Sterling dynasty will protect her. She has the respected last name. She has your grandfather's blessing, and she has the heirloom. I have nothing except your empty promises." Julian frowned, feeling the pressure mounting from all sides. "I have given you everything, Nora. I brought you into my world." Nora met his gaze with unyielding hardness. "You handed me a stolen ring that was stripped from my finger within an hour. That is not a future, Julian. I need to know right now if you are actually going to end that marriage, or if you are just a coward playing games." Over the following 2 weeks, Nora completely altered her strategy, abandoning direct confrontations with Elena in favor of staking small, highly visible claims on Julian's public life. She arranged for professional photographers to capture them exiting upscale restaurants in Manhattan, accompanied him to private art gallery openings in Boston, and attended high-profile charity benefits where several close associates of the Sterling family were present. She never introduced herself as his official fiancée, but she never corrected the society columnists who broadly hinted at their romance in the morning papers. Julian permitted these public appearances because they stroked his vanity, and because a deep, immature part of him still expected Elena to see the photographs, lose her composure, and finally fight for his attention. But whenever those society clippings were forwarded to Elena's phone, she simply deleted them without a second glance, focusing her energy on consulting with an independent legal advisor in downtown Boston to review her prenuptial agreements and understand her financial standing in the event of a permanent separation. Elena's profound, unshakable silence drove Julian to the brink of madness, far more than any screaming match or tearful accusation ever could have. One evening, after returning home to find her quietly reading an architectural journal in the study, he tossed a copy of a local society magazine onto the coffee table in front of her. "I assume you have seen the latest gossip columns?" Julian provoked, leaning over the sofa to gauge her reaction. Elena turned the page of her journal without looking at the glossy magazine. "I have." Julian pressed further, his irritation boiling over. "And you have absolutely nothing to say about it?" Elena finally closed her journal, looked directly into his eyes with weary sorrow, and asked, "Do you genuinely want my opinion, Julian? Or are you simply checking once again to see if you still possess the power to hurt me?" Julian stood frozen, rendered entirely speechless by her piercing insight, while Elena quietly rose and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the bitter realization that every attempt he made to incite her jealousy was merely pushing her further toward the exit. The escalating tension reached an explosive peak on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Nora arrived unannounced at the Boston brownstone, carrying a designer wool coat that Julian had left in the back seat of her car. Elena opened the door, surprised to see the woman standing on her front porch, but her expression remained perfectly neutral. Julian left this in my vehicle over the weekend, Nora said, stepping past the threshold uninvited with an arrogant smile. I thought it would be neighborly of me to return it in person. Elena closed the heavy front door and gestured toward the foyer bench. You may leave it there. Nora took a slow, deliberate walk around the expansive living room, her sharp eyes scanning the family portraits, the curated bookshelves, and the warm mementos of nearly 10 years of shared history. For the first time, Nora saw tangible evidence of a real, deeply rooted life that could not be easily erased, and an ugly wave of jealousy washed over her. It must be terribly exhausting living among the ghosts of a dead marriage, Nora remarked casually, tracing her finger along a framed photograph from their honeymoon in Florence. Elena stood tall in the center of the room, her voice steady and commanding. If you came here expecting to provoke a scene, Nora, you are wasting your time. You are standing in the private home of a married woman, desperately trying to convince yourself that this marriage is over because you need to believe you are something more than another man's temporary distraction. Nora's smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of sharp fury. Julian loves me, Elena. He is going to leave you. Elena did not blink. If he chooses to leave, that will be a private conversation between my husband and me. You will not dictate the terms of my life, nor will you ever have a say in my dignity. Nora threw the coat onto a leather armchair and sneered. You are only clinging to the sterling name because without it, you are completely nobody in this city. Elena felt a momentary surge of anger, but she remembered Leonard's wise counsel and let the insult pass harmlessly through her. That is where you are fundamentally mistaken, Elena replied softly. You crave this family name because you believe it will bestow worth upon you. I have come to realize that no name on earth is worth sacrificing my self-respect to keep. Now, get out of my home. When Julian arrived at the brownstone an hour later, he was shocked to find a medium leather suitcase resting beside the front door, and Elena quietly packing her clothes upstairs. What on earth are you doing? He demanded, rushing into the bedroom with genuine panic in his voice. Elena zipped her garment bag shut without turning around. I am checking into a hotel in Back Bay for a few days. Julian gripped her arm, but the moment she looked down at his hand, he immediately released his hold. Why? What happened? He asked frantically. Elena met his eyes with absolute clarity. Because Nora came into my home today, uninvited, to taunt me in my own living room. Julian's face paled. I swear to you, I had no idea she was coming here. I never asked her to do that. Elena picked up her coat. It no longer matters whether you asked her or not, Julian. What matters is that your actions over the past 6 months made her believe she had every right to invade my life whenever she pleased. I am leaving because this house no longer feels like a home. Julian stood in the hallway as Elena carried her luggage toward the stairs, feeling the foundation of his comfortable, controlled world crumbling beneath his feet. Elena, please, do not turn a few bad months into the permanent end of our entire marriage, he pleaded, following her down the grand staircase. Elena reached the front door, turned around, and looked at him with an expression of profound, heartbreaking finality. These were not just a few bad months, Julian. This was half a year of you methodically testing how much cruelty I could endure before I broke. She stepped out into the rainy Boston afternoon, closing the door firmly behind her. That evening, Julian called Nora in a blind fury, demanding to know why she had crossed the line by going to the brownstone. When Nora bitterly retorted that he was only panicking because his prized wife had finally walked out the door, Julian shouted into the receiver that Elena was still his wife, to which Nora coldly replied, "And I am still the fool waiting for promises you will never have the courage to keep," before hanging up the phone, leaving Julian utterly alone in the cavernous, empty brownstone. Elena had been staying at a quiet boutique hotel near Copley Square for 4 days when she received a handwritten note delivered by Leonard's personal driver, asking her to come to the Newport estate for an afternoon tea. When she entered the familiar library, she found the old man seated beside a collection of aged leather journals, 2 yellowed letters from the 1940s, and several black-and-white family photographs spread across the desk. Leonard pointed gently to an old photograph of his late wife, Evelyn, wearing the famous sapphire brooch and ring at an international diplomatic gala held over 40 years earlier. Julian has always operated under the foolish assumption that this sapphire is merely an expensive piece of jewelry meant to be passed down automatically to whichever woman holds his affection, Leonard said softly, opening one of the delicate, faded letters. He never once bothered to learn the profound sacrifice and history behind its existence. Elena sat across from the patriarch as he explained the true origins of the heirloom, revealing that the ring had originally belonged to Julian's great-grandmother, a woman of formidable character who had established a strict family tradition. The sapphire was never meant to be an automatic birthright inherited through marriage certificates or social standing. Rather, each generation was tasked with choosing a worthy guardian based entirely on moral character, loyalty, and quiet strength. Evelyn had received the jewel from Leonard's mother only after 10 years of devoted service to the family's philanthropic foundation, and after demonstrating unyielding grace during their darkest financial trials. In one of the preserved letters, Leonard's mother had written that the ring was meant to represent a sacred shield, intended for a woman who possessed the moral courage to protect the family's honor, even against the reckless mistakes committed by its own bloodline. Leonard then turned to a marked page in Evelyn's personal diary, written only a few months before Julian and Elena's wedding, when the matriarch was quietly battling her final illness. Evelyn had met Elena on several occasions during their courtship, and had penned a poignant observation that Leonard had kept private for nearly a decade. "If that dear young woman chooses to stand beside our Julian, I pray with all my soul that he learns humility and grace from her before she is forced to learn how to defend her dignity against him." Elena felt tears welling in her eyes as she read the elegant cursive script, deeply moved by the matriarch's uncanny foresight. Evelyn had recognized Julian's fatal flaw long before anyone else, his dangerous habit of confusing unconditional love with boundless permission to misbehave without consequence. Elena had spent years excusing his selfish outbursts and covering for his absences, only to realize that her boundless patience had inadvertently fed his belief that she would never actually leave. Among the archives lay another photograph taken the morning after Elena and Julian's civil ceremony, showing a youthful Leonard presenting the blue velvet box to Elena, who stood with her hands clasped respectfully, declining to put the jewel on her finger. Attached to the back of the frame was a small note from Evelyn. "Never force a woman to wear a crown she has not yet chosen to represent with her own life." Leonard looked up at Elena with gentle reverence. "When you declined to wear the sapphire all those years ago, my dear, you believed you were rejecting a symbol of high society. To me, that humble decision proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that you were the only person truly worthy of guarding it." Elena carefully slid the blue box across the mahogany desk toward the patriarch. "Then it must stay here with you, Leonard. My marriage is ending, and I cannot keep what belongs to the sterling name." Leonard placed his hand over the box and shook his head firmly. "We will make that decision when the dust settles, Elena. I did not take this ring from Nora, because you were Julian's wife. I took it because Julian was using our sacred history to legitimize cruelty. Even if you walk away from our name tomorrow, what he did will always remain entirely wrong. While Elena was uncovering the deep heritage of the heirloom, Julian was beginning to conduct his own quiet inquiries back in Boston, haunted by his grandfather's biting warnings about Nora's true intentions. He began reviewing old text conversations, noticing for the first time how frequently Nora had asked pointed questions regarding the ownership structure of the Newport estate, the distribution of the family trust funds, and whether Leonard held exclusive control over the commercial real estate holdings. What he had previously dismissed as innocent curiosity now felt like a calculated assessment of his net worth. The gnawing doubt turned into absolute certainty when Julian met with Arthur, the Sterling family's longtime private legal counsel, for a routine quarterly briefing. During their private lunch, Arthur casually mentioned that Nora had reached out to his office nearly 3 weeks earlier, asking specific questions about prenuptial agreements, asset division laws in Massachusetts, and what financial claims a legal wife retained in the event of an uncontested divorce. Julian left the lawyer's office in a state of smoldering rage and drove directly to Nora's high-rise apartment, confronting her the moment she opened the door. "You called Arthur behind my back to interrogate him about my family's assets?" Julian demanded, his voice trembling with betrayal. Nora crossed her arms, refusing to back down. "Of course I did, Julian. You have spent the last 6 months swearing that your marriage was finished, and I needed to know if we were facing a prolonged financial war with your wife. I refuse to apologize for protecting the future you promised me." Julian stared at her, feeling a cold realization wash over him. "I never promised you my family's estate, Nora. You were never interested in me. You were measuring the size of the throne you expected to inherit." The argument escalated into a bitter shouting match, with Nora furiously reminding Julian that he was the one who had stolen the sapphire to parade her in public, stripping him of his excuses until Julian realized with sickening clarity that both women had been caught in a web of his own arrogant creation. That evening, Elena returned to the Boston brownstone under the cover of dusk to collect her remaining personal belongings and winter clothing, finding Julian sitting alone in the dark living room. As she quietly packed her luggage in the bedroom, Julian appeared in the doorway, his arrogance entirely shattered, replaced by a hollow look of defeat. "I spoke with Nora today," he admitted quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Elena continued folding her wool sweaters into the suitcase. "That is between the two of you, Julian." Julian stepped into the room. "She called our family attorney weeks ago to ask about divorce settlements and property deeds. She was calculating everything from the start." Elena zipped her suitcase shut, looked at him with profound exhaustion, and said, "Do you honestly expect me to feel comforted by that? Nora may be ambitious and calculating, Julian, but she never stood before an altar and promised to cherish me. She did not know the sacred history of your family, but you did. You are the one who broke every vow, and discovering that your mistress has selfish motives does not make you the victim in this story." Julian dropped his head into his hands, unable to look his wife in the eye as the crushing weight of his guilt settled upon his shoulders. "I only wanted you to fight for me, Elena," he confessed in a broken whisper. "When you started pulling away emotionally, I convinced myself that you no longer loved me, and I used Nora to see if I could still make you jealous." Elena looked at him with tears shimmering in her eyes. "You could have simply talked to me, Julian. You could have come home one evening, sat across from me, and told me you were terrified of losing our connection. Instead, you chose to inflict calculated cruelty until you forced a reaction out of me. That is not love. That is vanity." Before leaving the brownstone, Elena placed a copy of Evelyn's old journal entry on the dining table, allowing Julian to finally read his late grandmother's warning with his own eyes. As the front door clicked shut, Julian read the faded words again and again, realizing with devastating finality that the wife he had taken for granted had possessed the very soul of the family he had so carelessly dishonored. The following afternoon, Leonard summoned Julian to the Newport Library, placing the original 19th-century family deeds and Evelyn's handwritten letters directly in front of him on the desk. "I am not showing you these documents to persuade you to beg for Elena's return," Leonard stated bluntly, his voice steady and cold. "That decision rests entirely in her hands, and frankly, I doubt you deserve her forgiveness. I brought you here so you can finally understand the catastrophic scale of what you have desecrated." Julian read through the fragile pages in absolute silence, discovering that 2 generations earlier, an arrogant granduncle had similarly attempted to use the family sapphire to assert dominance over his siblings, resulting in his immediate and permanent expulsion from the family trust. His great-grandmother had explicitly inscribed into the family ledger that no material symbol of the Sterlings should ever be wielded as an instrument of humiliation or personal vanity. Nora was unaware of this history, Julian muttered quietly, staring down at the aged ink. Leonard slammed his palm against the mahogany desk, making the crystal inkwell rattle. "Nora is a symptom of your own moral corruption, Julian. You knew that ring was locked away under my protection, and yet you stole it anyway because you wanted to feel like a conqueror. You wanted to prove to yourself that you could destroy your wife's peace and face no consequences." Julian looked up, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why did you give the ring to Elena, if she is planning to divorce me?" Leonard looked at his grandson with profound disappointment. "Because family is not defined by bloodlines or marriage certificates, Julian. It is defined by honor, sacrifice, and character. Elena cared for your grandmother during her final months without ever asking for recognition. She stood by your mother through her surgery, and she defended your name in public even while you were humiliating her in private. Nora wanted the ring before she even understood our values, while Elena guarded its honor for a decade without ever demanding to wear it. If you cannot perceive that difference, you are far more foolish than I feared." Realizing that she was rapidly losing her grip on Julian, Nora decided to make one final desperate maneuver when she received an invitation to an exclusive family charity gala at the Newport Mansion, organized by an unsuspecting cousin who was unaware of the recent scandal. Despite Julian's explicit warnings over the phone, commanding her not to attend, Nora dressed in a striking white designer gown, styled her hair impeccably, and arrived at the estate on Saturday evening with an air of unyielding confidence. When she stepped into the grand ballroom, conversations among the gathered guests abruptly ceased, the social circle watching in stunned silence as she boldly approached Julian near the marble fireplace. "I told you not to come here, Nora," Julian hissed under his breath, his face tightening with embarrassment. Nora tilted her chin up, offering a sharp, defiant smile. "I was formally invited, Julian, and I refuse to hide in the shadows like a shameful secret, while your family treats me like an outcast." Across the ballroom, Elena entered through the double doors, dressed in an understated navy silk gown, with her shoulders back and her hands completely free of jewelry. She had left the sapphire safely stored away, refusing to use the heirloom as a weapon in a petty social contest. Several aunts and cousins immediately gathered around Elena, greeting her with genuine warmth and quiet respect, demonstrating that her place in their hearts had never been tied to Julian's approval. Julian watched her from across the room, realizing with aching clarity that Elena possessed a natural, effortless grace that Nora could never replicate, no matter how expensive her gown or how loudly she demanded attention. When Nora noticed Julian's lingering gaze, her resentment boiled over, and she pulled him into an alcove, hissing, "Are you going to spend the entire evening pining after the wife who abandoned you? Or are you going to stand by the promises you made to me?" Julian looked at Nora with an expression of profound weariness, the illusions that had clouded his judgment over the past 6 months finally evaporating completely. "I made promises to you out of spite and wounded pride, Nora," Julian admitted, his voice carrying clearly into the nearby parlor. "I used you to provoke my wife, and you used my anger to try and secure a lifestyle you never earned. We were both entirely wrong, and I will not spend another second pretending this was about love." Nora recoiled as if slapped, her face turning crimson with rage as several prominent guests overheard the exchange. Losing all sense of decorum, Nora stormed out of the alcove, marched directly toward Elena in the center of the ballroom, and pointed an accusing finger at her. "Are you satisfied now, Elena?" Nora shouted, shattering the polite hum of the party. "You play the quiet, helpless victim while manipulating this entire family into treating me like a monster." Elena calmly set her champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray and faced her accuser without a flicker of fear. "I never asked Julian to betray his vows, Nora, nor did I ask you to enter my home. You chose to parade yourself into my life, and you chose to wear a stolen heirloom to mock me. You do not need my help to look disgraceful. Your own actions have accomplished that quite well." Nora sneered, her voice trembling with venom. "You are only staying close to this family because you want the sterling fortune, the Newport estate, and the legal settlements." Before Julian or Leonard could intervene, Arthur, the family attorney who was standing among the guests, stepped forward with quiet authority. "That is factually incorrect, Ms. Vance," Arthur announced clearly. "Elena retained independent counsel weeks ago and has formally waived all claims to the Sterling Family Trust, requesting only an equitable division of personal property. In contrast, you were the one who contacted my office demanding details on trusts and real estate transfers." A wave of shocked gasps swept through the ballroom as the absolute truth was laid bare before the entire New England social circle. Nora stood frozen, completely exposed and stripped of her rehearsed victimhood, looking around the room at the sea of disapproving faces. Turning to Julian in a last-ditch plea for support, she found only his downcast eyes and silence. "Julian, tell them you promised me a life together," she demanded frantically. Julian looked up, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I did promise you things I had no right to offer while I was a married man, Nora. I used you to test my wife's loyalty, and I stole my grandmother's ring to inflict pain on an innocent woman. The blame belongs entirely to me." With her social ambitions permanently destroyed and her pride shattered, Nora turned on her heel and fled the estate in tears, while Julian remained rooted to the floor, finally understanding that his desperate quest for validation had cost him the only woman who had ever truly loved his soul. Following the disastrous charity gala, the remaining guests dispersed into the night, leaving Leonard, Julian, and Elena alone in the quiet, cavernous ballroom beneath the dying light of the chandeliers. Elena reached into her evening clutch, pulled out the small blue velvet box, and placed it gently onto the marble side table between them. The sapphire rested inside, gleaming with timeless brilliance against its silk cushion. I brought this back tonight because I never want this ring to be used as an excuse or a bargaining chip again, Elena said, her voice soft yet unbreakable. Leonard gave it to me to right an injustice, but my worth as a woman has never depended on whether I possess an heirloom, and I no longer need to stay in this marriage to prove that I was worthy of respect. Julian looked down at the jewel, his eyes brimming with unshed tears as he whispered, "Please, Elena, give me one more opportunity to prove that I can change." Elena looked at him with gentle sorrow and replied, "Changing out of fear of losing me is not enough, Julian. You must learn why you sought to destroy me in the first place, and you must do that work for your own soul, even if I never return." Over the subsequent 2 weeks, Julian ceased all attempts to offer defensive rationalizations or shift the blame onto Nora. He remained entirely alone in the cavernous Boston brownstone, refusing to attend social gatherings or corporate dinners, spending his evenings reflecting on the devastating wreckage of his own making. Elena, meanwhile, finalized the paperwork for a legal separation through her attorney, declining to pursue alimony, family trust shares, or the historical properties. When Julian received the formal separation agreement in the mail, he did not hire aggressive litigators to fight the terms. Instead, he requested one final private meeting at the Newport estate to sign the documents in the presence of his grandfather. When Elena arrived at the library on a crisp autumn morning, she found Julian waiting with dark circles beneath his eyes, his posture humble and stripped of all the arrogance that had once defined his presence. "I received the agreement, Elena," Julian said softly, gesturing to the papers resting on the mahogany desk. Elena took a seat across from him, her composure calm and steady. "I wanted this process to be respectful and clean, Julian. I have no desire to wage a public war against you or your family." Julian picked up his fountain pen, his hand steady for the first time in months. "I am signing it today without contest. If I attempted to use wealth or legal maneuvers to force you to stay, I would merely be repeating the exact same cruelty that brought us to this point. You loved me far better than I ever deserved, Elena. And my greatest tragedy is that I only learned how to value your heart after I completely destroyed your trust." Leonard, who had been sitting quietly by the hearth, watched as his grandson signed each page of the document with quiet dignity. Recognizing that while the marriage was lost, Julian was finally beginning the painful, necessary journey toward genuine redemption. 1 month later, Elena signed a lease on a charming, light-filled apartment in a quiet, historic neighborhood of Boston, entirely funded by her own independent career as an interior design consultant. The apartment lacked the sprawling ballrooms of the Newport mansion and the opulent marble finishes of the brownstone. But every single piece of furniture, every potted plant on the windowsill, and every painting on the wall had been chosen by her own free will. On her first evening in the new home, she placed the small blue box in her writing desk drawer, made herself a simple dinner, and sat by the window watching the sunset over the Charles River. She felt a profound sense of mourning for the dreams she had once nurtured, but beneath the grief lay an overwhelming wave of peace. She did not harbor hatred for Julian. She simply recognized that understanding a man's brokenness did not mean she was obligated to let him destroy her spirit in the process. 6 months after the separation was finalized, Leonard hosted a private family luncheon at the Newport estate to celebrate his 78th birthday, extending a warm, personal invitation to Elena. After much consideration, Elena accepted the invitation, realizing that avoiding the estate would only grant the painful memories power over her life. When she arrived, the family welcomed her with open arms and genuine affection, treating her not as an estranged in-law, but as an enduring and cherished member of their inner circle. Julian was present as well, looking healthier and more centered, working quietly with local charitable foundations and seeking personal therapy to confront his deep-seated insecurities. When they crossed paths on the garden terrace overlooking the ocean, Julian noticed her bare hands and smiled gently. "You never needed that sapphire to belong here, Elena," he said with sincere humility. Elena smiled back, the final remnants of bitterness washing away on the ocean breeze. "No, Julian, and you never needed to tear me down to feel worthy of love." During the birthday toast, Leonard raised his crystal glass and addressed the gathered family with words that would echo in their hearts for generations to come. For too many decades, we have operated under the foolish illusion that carrying the sterling name is an automatic guarantee of honor and integrity, the old man declared, his eyes sweeping across his children, his grandchildren, and resting warmly upon Elena. A prestigious family name is nothing more than a recorded history. It is our daily choices, our humility, and our capacity for genuine respect that determine whether we deserve to carry it forward. I have witnessed those born into our bloodline forget the sacred meaning of decency, and I have seen those who joined us from the outside remind us of what truly matters. True nobility is not found in heirlooms or bank accounts. It is found in the quiet courage to live with an unbroken soul. Life has a profound way of stripping away our carefully constructed illusions, forcing us to confront the undeniable truth that material wealth, generational prestige, and outward symbols of status are entirely meaningless without the foundation of genuine respect and moral integrity. We often navigate our relationships under the dangerous assumption that the people who love us unconditionally will endure endless cruelty, mistaking their patience for weakness and their quiet grace for an inability to walk away. Yet the human heart, no matter how devoted, possesses an invisible threshold. Every unspoken insult, every calculated betrayal, and every attempt to manufacture jealousy gradually chips away at the sacred bond of trust until nothing remains but hollow regret. True maturity is recognizing that love is never a battlefield where one person must be conquered or humiliated to validate the insecure ego of another, but a sacred sanctuary built on mutual honor, emotional safety, and unwavering fidelity. When we treat our partners like disposable prizes or tools to satisfy our vanity, we inevitably find ourselves standing alone in the ruins of our own arrogance, discovering too late that the easiest thing in the world is to destroy a person's trust, and the hardest thing is to live with the knowledge that we force them to build a life without us. Belonging is never something that can be stolen, demanded, or inherited through a piece of jewelry or a prominent family name. It is a quiet grace that must be earned through consistent character, selfless sacrifice, and the moral courage to protect those who trust us with their hearts. Ultimately, the greatest victory in any human journey is not defeating a rival or proving our superiority to those who seek our downfall, but possessing the profound self-worth to walk away from spaces where our dignity is compromised, stepping forward into the light with a clear conscience, a peaceful spirit, and a heart that remains entirely unbroken.